They called you too much, too sensitive, too rebellious, too loud, too quiet, too different, too intense, too strange, too difficult, too everything that the family needed you to not be so that things could stay comfortable for everyone else. You were the one at the dinner table who asked the question nobody wanted to answer. You were the one who did not laugh at the joke that everyone else laughed at because something about it felt wrong and you could not pretend it did not. You were the one who looked at the path that was being laid out for you and felt in your bones that it belonged to someone else. And so they gave you a name, not your real name, a label. The black sheep, the difficult one, the problem child, the one we do not talk about at family gatherings, the one who needs to be managed, redirected, corrected, brought back into line. And here is what nobody in that family ever stopped long enough to consider. Every single thing they criticized you for was actually a sign. Not a sign that something was wrong with you. A sign that something was extraordinarily right. Introduction. Over 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece, there was a man who was rejected by his city, mocked by philosophers, and considered by polite society to be an embarrassment to the entire intellectual tradition. His name was Diogenes of Sinope. He lived in a large ceramic jar in the marketplace. He owned nothing. He insulted kings to their faces and laughed when they threatened him. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the known world, visited him and offered to grant him any wish, Diogenes looked up and said, "Step out of my sunlight." Alexander walked away and told his companions that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. The man who had nothing impressed the man who had everything. Diogenes was the original black sheep, exiled from his hometown, stripped of his citizenship, cast out of every respectable circle he entered. What did he do with all of that rejection? He turned it into a philosophy that said the people who condemn you are the ones most imprisoned by what they fear, and the things they punish you for are almost always the things most worth keeping. This is the story of why the black sheep always succeeds, and it begins with understanding exactly what reprimands and ostracization actually do to a person who is strong enough to survive them. Part 1. Reprimands are a map of what threatens the system. Here is the first thing you need to understand about every reprimand you ever received. It was never really about you. When a family, a community, a social group, or an institution reprimands someone, they are not doing it because that person is broken. They are doing it because that person is threatening. Threatening to the unspoken rules, threatening to the shared illusions, threatening to the fragile consensus that holds the group together. Diogenes understood this with ruthless clarity. He called it typhos, which roughly translates to smoke or vapor, the fog of social convention, the collective hallucination that people agree to live inside because the alternative, thinking for themselves, is too terrifying to contemplate. And the black sheep threatens the typhos, not intentionally always, not as a deliberate act of rebellion in most cases, simply by being what they are, by asking real questions, by refusing to pretend, by feeling things fully instead of managing them into acceptable shapes, by following an internal compass in a family that navigates entirely by external ones. Think about what you were reprimanded for. Were you told you were too emotional? That meant the family ran on emotional suppression and you refused to suppress. Were you told you were too rebellious? That meant the family ran on obedience and you were following your own judgment instead of theirs. Were you told you were too sensitive? That meant the family ran on numbness and you were still alive enough to feel what was real. Every reprimand was a map. It showed you exactly where the system was fragile, exactly where the walls had cracks, exactly where the official story did not match the actual truth. And the fact that you could see those cracks, that you could not pretend they were not there, was not your weakness. It was your perceptiveness, your integrity, your unwillingness to sacrifice what was real on the altar of what was convenient. Diogenes was reprimanded by the entire city of Athens for refusing to observe social conventions. He urinated in public, ate in the marketplace, told Plato his definitions were empty, and every act of transgression was specifically aimed at the places where Athenian society was performing rather than being. He was not crazy. He was diagnostic. And so were you. Part 2. Ostracization forces the development of an internal world. Here is what happens to the child who is never fully accepted by their family. They go inward. Not as a trauma response alone. Yes, there is pain. Yes, there is the wound of not belonging where you were supposed to belong first. That wound is real and it deserves to be acknowledged. But alongside that pain, something else happens that the accepted children, the ones who fit the mold, the ones who were rewarded for compliance, never develop in the same way. The black sheep builds an interior life. Because when the external world does not offer you a home, you build one inside yourself. You read more. You think more. You question more. You develop a relationship with your own mind that the people who were always comfortable in the crowd never needed to develop. You learn to tolerate solitude without being destroyed by it. You learn to sit with discomfort without immediately running from it. You learn to find meaning inside yourself rather than borrowing it from the approval of others. Diogenes took this to its ultimate extreme. He did not just go inward. He made inwardness his entire philosophy. He called himself a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan, precisely because he refused to derive his identity from any particular group or city or tradition. His belonging was to something larger, and his self-sufficiency was so complete that he needed nothing from the people who had rejected him, and that self-sufficiency became his greatest power. Modern psychology has a term for what the black sheep develops through ostracization. It is called internal locus of control. The belief and, more importantly, the lived experience that your value, your direction, your sense of self, comes from inside you rather than from external validation. Research consistently shows that people with a strong internal locus of control are more resilient in the face of adversity, more persistent in the pursuit of long-term goals, more creative in problem-solving, and more psychologically stable when circumstances turn difficult. The family that rejected you accidentally gave you the greatest possible training in this. Every time they withheld approval, you were forced to find it in yourself or go without. And going without, as painful as it was, taught you that you could, that you were sufficient, that your worth did not depend on their recognition of it. The approved child learns to need the crowd. The black sheep learns to stand alone. And in a world that rewards independence, originality, and resilience, the one who learned to stand alone starts every race already several steps ahead. Part 3. The mask never fits, and that is the gift. Every family has a script, not a written one, an invisible one, a set of unspoken rules about who you are supposed to be, what you are supposed to want, how you are supposed to feel, and what you are absolutely never supposed to say out loud. The accepted members of the family learn this script early and perform it fluently. They shape themselves around its demands. They become very, very good at being who the family needs them to be. And they pay a price for that fluency that most of them will not discover until they are much older and standing in the wreckage of a life that looked right from the outside but never felt like theirs from the inside. The black sheep could never learn the script. Not fully, not convincingly. They tried in many cases. They tried desperately. But the mask never fit right. There was always something underneath it pushing back. Some part of them that refused to fully disappear into the performance. And every time that refusal surfaced, every time the mask slipped, the family reprimanded them back into shape. But here is the philosophical truth that Diogenes spent his entire life demonstrating. The mask is the problem, not the face beneath it. Diogenes called his practice of radical honesty and radical authenticity living according to nature. He believed that most human suffering came from the gap between what people truly were and what social convention demanded they perform. And he believed that the path to genuine freedom, genuine flourishing, genuine power ran directly through the willingness to close that gap, to be exactly what you are. No performance, no apology. The black sheep, by being unable to sustain the performance that the family demanded, was living closer to their actual nature than anyone else in the house. And living close to your actual nature, even when it is painful, even when it is rejected, gives you access to something the performers never have. Your real self. Not the curated version. Not the approved version. Not the version that knows what to say at Christmas dinner to keep everyone comfortable. The raw, full, actual self that has its own intelligence, its own gifts, its own direction, its own reasons for being here. That self does not come out of compliance. It never has. It comes out of exactly the kind of friction and rejection that the black sheep was subjected to their entire childhood. Before we go any further, I have to say something directly to you. If you were the black sheep, if you grew up feeling like too much or not enough, if you were reprimanded for things that in hindsight were actually your greatest qualities, then this channel was built for ideas like this one. Every week we explore philosophy that is not decorative but functional. Ideas that reframe your story and give you the language to understand what actually happened to you and why it made you who you are. Subscribe right now if you have not already. Turn on notifications and leave a comment below telling me your black sheep story. Were you the rebel, the sensitive one, the questioner? Tell me. I want to know. And so does everyone else watching this. Now let us keep going because we are just getting to the part where everything turns. Part 4. Rejection calibrates your tolerance for discomfort. Diogenes practiced something he called askesis. It is the root of our word ascetic, but Diogenes meant something specific by it. He meant deliberate exposure to discomfort for the purpose of building the capacity to function freely regardless of circumstances. He would roll in hot sand in summer and embrace cold statues in winter. He would eat simple food when luxurious food was available. He would sleep outside when shelter was offered. Not because he was performing suffering, but because he understood something that most comfortable people never learn. The person who is afraid of discomfort is controlled by anyone who can threaten them with it. And the person who has been through discomfort and survived it is free in a way that comfort can never produce. The black sheep went through a very specific kind of discomfort for years. The discomfort of not belonging, of being seen as the problem, of carrying the emotional weight of a family's dysfunction while being called the dysfunction yourself, of sitting at a table full of people who share your blood and feeling completely alone. That is not small discomfort. That is a training ground, and what it trained you to do, even if you do not fully realize it yet, was to function without the social approval that most people are completely dependent on. Think about what stops most people from pursuing what they actually want. Fear of judgment, fear of failure in front of others, fear of being seen as strange or different or not good enough, fear of being excluded from the group. You lived inside that fear your entire childhood. You did not get to avoid it. You were marinated in it. And at some point, somewhere in the years of reprimand and ostracization, something in you stopped waiting for the approval that was never going to come and started moving anyway. That movement, that decision to go forward without permission, that is the single most important psychological shift a person can make. And most people never make it because they were never pushed to the edge where it became necessary. You were pushed there early, by the very family that thought they were containing you. And what they were actually doing was forging you. Part 5. The outsider sees what the insider cannot. There is a concept in sociology called the view from the margins. The idea is that people who exist at the edges of a group or a system, people who were never fully absorbed into its center, develop a kind of perception that insiders cannot access, because the insider is too close, too embedded, too invested in the system's narrative to see it clearly. The outsider, the one who was pushed to the margins whether they chose it or not, can see the whole shape of the thing, can see the contradictions, can see the gap between what the group says it is and what it actually does, can see the human cost of the rules that everyone else has agreed to stop questioning. Diogenes was this figure in ancient Athens. He was not a citizen in good standing. He was not embedded in the philosophical establishment. He had no school, no institutional affiliation, no reputation to protect. And from that position of radical marginality, he could see things that Plato and Aristotle, embedded as they were in the structures of Athenian intellectual life, could not see or would not say. He could say that the emperor had no clothes before that phrase even existed. The black sheep carries this same gift. Because you were never fully inside the family system, because you were always watching it from a slightly removed position, you developed a perception about family dynamics, about social performance, about the difference between what people say and what they mean, that the accepted siblings simply do not have. You know how the machine works from having been ground by it. And that knowledge, that hard-won sociological and psychological literacy, is enormously valuable in a world that desperately needs people who can see clearly, speak honestly, and diagnose what is real beneath what is performed. The outsider who learns to use their perspective becomes the one everyone eventually turns to when the comfortable narratives stop working, when the systems start failing, when the people who always fit in suddenly find themselves in a world where fitting in is no longer enough. That moment is coming for everyone, and the black sheep has been preparing for it their whole life. Part 6, Diogenes and the Philosophy of Radical Self-Ownership. When Diogenes was captured by pirates and sold into slavery, he stood on the auction block and pointed to a man in the crowd and said, "Sell me to that man. He needs a master." The crowd was stunned. He was the one being sold. He had no legal standing, no freedom, no power in any conventional sense, and he was directing the auction. Because real power, the kind of power that Diogenes embodied and that the black sheep is in the process of discovering, is not about external circumstances. It is about who owns your inner life. The black sheep went through a process, painful and long and often invisible, of learning that nobody gets to own their inner life but them. Not the parent who called them too difficult. Not the sibling who rolled their eyes. Not the extended family that told the story of the difficult one at every gathering. Not the teachers who called home. Not the system that kept trying to shape them into something more manageable. None of them got inside. Not all the way. And that incompleteness of the intrusion, the fact that there was always something at the core that remained ungoverned, is the beginning of radical self-ownership. Diogenes would call it autarkeia, self-sufficiency, the condition of needing nothing from outside to be whole, not approval, not validation, not permission, not belonging on someone else's terms. This does not mean isolation. It does not mean bitterness. It does not mean never needing other people. It means that your foundation is your own, that you are the author of your own standard, that you do not adjust the truth of what you are to fit the comfort of what someone else needs you to be. The black sheep arrives at this not through a seminar or a self-help book. They arrive at it because rejection taught them the hard way and the only way that truly sticks, that waiting for the family to see them clearly was a project with no end date. And so they stopped waiting. The moment they stopped waiting was the moment they became free. Part 7. Success is inevitable for the one who was forced to build from the inside out. Here is the final truth, the one that pulls everything together. Success, real success, not the performance of it, but the actual experience of building something meaningful and living a life that feels genuinely yours, requires one thing above all others. It requires knowing who you actually are, not who you were told you were, not who the family script assigned you to be, not the role you were given at the table. Who you actually are, what you actually value, what genuinely moves you, what you are willing to build through difficulty because it matters to you at a level that has nothing to do with what anyone else thinks of it. The accepted child, the one who performed the script fluently, often does not know who they are until middle age or later, because they spent the years when that question was supposed to be answered occupied with the work of fitting in. Their identity is borrowed. Their ambitions are inherited. Their life is recognizably correct and quietly hollow. The black sheep was denied that option. They could not borrow an identity because the family's identity never quite fit. They could not inherit ambitions that were never intended for someone like them. They had to go looking for their own, in books, in ideas, in the quiet of their own mind, in the experiences they had to seek out alone because nobody was going to offer them. And that search, as lonely as it was, produced something irreplaceable, genuine self-knowledge. Diogenes said, "Know thyself." And he meant it not as a philosophical platitude, but as a survival strategy. The person who knows themselves cannot be manipulated by the threat of rejection because they already know what they are without the group's confirmation. They cannot be controlled by the withdrawal of approval because they already know their own worth. They cannot be stopped by the fear of being different because they have been different their whole life and they know it did not kill them. They are, in the truest sense, free. And free people build things. They pursue things, they create things. They take risks that terrified people cannot take. They stay the course through difficulty that approval-dependent people cannot endure. They follow their vision past the point where most people turn back because they are not running on external fuel. They are running on something that nobody can take away. This is why the black sheep succeeds, not in spite of the reprimands, not in spite of the ostracization, not in spite of being cast out and called too much and handed a label that was supposed to define their ceiling. Because of it. Every single bit of it. Diogenes of Sinope was exiled from his city, stripped of his citizenship, and spent his life sleeping in a jar in the marketplace. He is remembered 2,000 years later as one of the most intellectually courageous human beings who ever lived. Alexander the Great conquered the known world, and every history student learns his name. But it is the story of the encounter with Diogenes, the emperor standing over the philosopher asking what he can do for him, and the philosopher saying, "Get out of my light," that people cannot forget. Because power bowed to freedom. The most powerful man in the world looked at the man who had nothing and recognized something in him that all his armies could not purchase. That is the trajectory of the black sheep. Not a life of ease, not a life of early acceptance or smooth passage or family approval at every milestone, but a life of something rarer, a life of genuine autonomy, a life built on a foundation that was tested by fire and held, a life where the person looking back at you in the mirror at the end of it is actually you, not the performance, not the compromise. You, if you were the black sheep, understand this. The family did not make you. They could not. And the trying, the reprimands, the ostracization, the labels, all of it only made the thing inside you more defined, more solid, more undeniably yours. Diogenes would look at you and recognize you immediately. He would say nothing. He would just move over and make room in the sunlight. And that is more than enough. If this video spoke to something real in you, share it with the black sheep in your life. They need to hear this. Subscribe if you have not already, because every single week we bring philosophy to the parts of your life that need it most. and drop your story in the comments. I will be reading every one. I will see you in the next one.